Imagine walking into the most exclusive private club in Chicago, where the chandeliers cost more than most people's homes, where every smile is calculated and every silence is deliberate, and where no one, not a single person in that gilded room, bothers to look at the little girl sitting alone in the corner. She doesn't cry. She doesn't reach for anyone. She sits perfectly still, like a child who has already learned, at far too young an age, that asking for help is a language no one around her speaks. Renee Caldwell saw her the moment she walked in. And unlike everyone else in that room, she didn't look away. What happened next would cost Renee her job, shatter the carefully controlled world of one of the most powerful men in the country, and bring to light a secret so dark that years of money and silence had barely been enough to keep it buried. This is a story about what happens when a child who has forgotten how to speak finds the one person who already knows the language of silence, and what happens when two people, broken in completely different ways, are forced to choose between the walls they've built and the life that is waiting for them on the other side. If this story moves you, subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell us, what was the moment that broke you open? The Whitmore Club had existed at the corner of Michigan Avenue and East Erie Street since 1923. It had survived 2 recessions, 1 prohibition, and 1 pandemic. And through all of it, the building had maintained the particular, impervious quality of a place that has decided it will simply outlast whatever comes. The marble floors were original. The oak paneling in the 3rd-floor dining room had been polished so many times over the decades that it had developed a warmth that looked almost alive in candlelight. The club smelled of old wood and good leather, and the faint residue of a century of expensive decisions. Renee Caldwell had been working there for 14 months. She had started as a banquet server and worked her way to the private dining floor, which came with a modest raise, and the understanding that discretion was not optional, but structural. It was built into the job the way plumbing was built into the walls, invisible and essential. She knew which members preferred their sparkling water still, and which preferred it cold enough to make the glass sweat. She knew the difference between a table that wanted to be left alone and a table that wanted to feel attended to. She had developed the particular fluency of service workers who must read rooms without ever appearing to be reading them, and she had made a private discipline of caring exactly as much as the job required and not a molecule more. She had been protecting herself with that discipline for 4 years. It had become so natural she barely noticed she was doing it anymore. That discipline came apart on a Thursday evening in March. The 3rd-floor private dining room had been reserved for a Korean investment group. 12 covers, white orchids, the good crystal, a menu that the kitchen had spent 3 days refining. Renee had done the setup herself. She was pouring the first round of sparkling water when the double doors opened and Yoo-Jin Baek walked in. She had heard the name before, in the way that people who pour water for the powerful hear names, carried on the underside of other conversations, attached to numbers that didn't feel real. Baek Capital, 17 billion in managed assets. Offices in Seoul, London, and now a new Chicago headquarters, whose lease had apparently been the most expensive commercial transaction in the city that quarter. He was 40 years old. He moved through the room the way powerful men move when they've stopped needing to perform power, not slowly, not with drama, simply with the absolute assumption that the space would arrange itself around him. He was also holding the hand of a small girl. The child was perhaps 7 years old, slight, with dark eyes that moved in slow arcs around the room, the way an animal assesses new territory, not frightened, not curious in any ordinary sense, but conducting a careful, systematic inventory. She wore a navy dress and white stockings, and her hair had been pulled back with a precision that suggested someone else had done it for her with great care. She walked beside her father without expression, neither resisting nor leaning into him, present in the room but somehow sealed off from it, as if she had learned to keep herself in a separate container from whatever was happening around her. Renee watched the room respond. The investment associates found their seats with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to these evenings. The senior managers moved toward Yoo-Jin with the particular warmth that proximity to money inspires. And the little girl, quietly, without drama, without anyone acknowledging it was happening, was released from her father's hand and guided to a chair at the far end of the table, near the window, at the edge of the conversation. Not a real seat at the table, a place that said, "You are here, but you are not part of this." 2 other servers moved around the table, filling glasses, presenting bread. Renee noticed how they adjusted their routes near the far end. Small, instinctive calibrations, the kind of rerouting people do when something makes them uncertain and they don't know why. The girl made people uncomfortable. They couldn't have explained it. They only knew they didn't have the right tools for it, so they chose not to try. Renee set her tray down on the sideboard. She crossed the room. She crouched down beside the chair until she was at eye level with the girl, which required a genuine effort given the heels she was required to wear. And she looked at her directly, not with the sideways, slightly avoidant look that adults give children they're uncertain about, but fully, openly, the way you look at someone you intend to speak to. Up close, the child's stillness was even more striking than it had appeared from across the room. It was not the stillness of obedience or shyness. It was the stillness of someone who had, at a very young age, developed a sophisticated system for processing the world from a protected distance. She had learned to make herself very quiet inside the noise. Whatever was going on behind those dark eyes was active and sharp and entirely her own. Renee raised her right hand. She formed the sign, simple and clear, the flat B hand at her chin, moving outward. In American Sign Language, the universal opening. Hello. The girl's eyes sharpened immediately. Her body did not move, not a centimeter, but something behind her face did. A rapid interior rearrangement, as if someone had turned a light on in a room that had been dark. She stared at Renee's hand, then, slowly, at Renee's face. Back to the hand, as if she was calibrating something, checking a reading she hadn't expected to get. Renee signed again, slower this time. My name is Renee. What is yours? The girl's lips did not open. They had not opened since she'd walked into the room, and Renee had already intuited, from the quality of the silence around her, that they would not. But her right hand lifted, just slightly, from her lap, the movement barely perceptible, as if she wasn't sure yet whether she was permitted to make it, and formed a single letter against her chest. The letter S. It was not a full answer. But it was an answer, the first voluntary response to another person that Sana Bayek had produced in this building in months. Renee was still holding the smile when she became aware of the shadow falling across her from behind. She stood. Eugene Bayek stood close enough that she had to look up, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has been trained to make decisions very quickly and is currently making one. His jaw was set. His eyes were controlled, but underneath the composure, visible only because it moved before the composure could close over it, was something that looked very much like terror. It was gone in less than a second. If she hadn't been looking directly at him, she would have missed it entirely. What do you think you're doing? It was not a question. It was a statement arranged in the shape of one. I was saying hello to your daughter. She doesn't communicate with strangers. She started to. The thing moved across his face again, sealed itself over. You are a server in this club. Your function is the table. You do not approach my daughter without my explicit permission. And you certainly do not. I understand. She kept her voice completely level. Not cold, not apologetic. Level. She signed the letter S. I believe she was beginning to tell me her name. The silence that followed had a complicated texture. Every person at that table was studying the tablecloth with extraordinary concentration. Renee held his gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than was comfortable, then picked up her tray and returned to her station. The manager's summons came 11 minutes later. When she walked out of the Whitmore Club that night, it was with an empty envelope where her next paycheck would have been. and the residue of a feeling she couldn't name. Not quite regret, not quite rightness. Something in between that she would think about on the bus home and still not be able to categorize. Renee's apartment in Pilsen was on the 3rd floor of a building whose landlord described it as full of character, and which Renee described as cold for most of the year and very hot for the part that wasn't. She had lived there for 3 years. She knew which floorboards to avoid after 10 p.m., and which radiator pipe knocked at 2 in the morning, and which neighbor's dog would bark at exactly 6:45 whether or not anyone had rung the bell. It was small and imperfect, and she had made a home of it through sheer insistence. She sat at the kitchen table that Thursday night and ran the numbers she already knew by heart, the way you return to a problem hoping the math has changed while you weren't looking. Rent was due in 11 days. The invoice from the North Shore Rehabilitation Center in Evanston, her mother's facility, the only one with the specific combination of neurorehabilitation and aphasia therapy that Diane Caldwell needed, was sitting on the counter with the total circled in the automatic red of a thing past due. She had been working double shifts for 8 months to stay ahead of it. She had believed, in a way she now recognized as fragile, that staying ahead was the same as being safe. She had learned at 23 that safety was not a state you achieved. It was a practice you maintained, and it required more than you expected, and it cost more than was fair, and it demanded the things you had set aside for yourself. Her mother, Diane Caldwell, was 63 years old. She had been a school librarian for 27 years in the Chicago public school system. She had raised Renee alone after Renee's father left when Renee was 4, and she had done it with a kind of cheerful, unsentimental competence that Renee had spent years trying to understand and was still working on. 2 years ago, at 61, Diane had suffered a hemorrhagic stroke in the parking lot of the Jewel Osco on Cermak Road. A stranger had called the ambulance. By the time Renee reached the hospital, her mother was in surgery. The stroke had left Diane with significant mobility impairment on her left side and moderate aphasia, a condition that attacked the architecture of language specifically, leaving the person fully present in their own mind while making that mind difficult for others to access. Renee knew the neuroscience of it in exact clinical detail. She had studied it. She had studied it because she had spent 2 years in the pre-med program at the University of Illinois, Chicago, with the intention of becoming a neurologist, before the stroke happened, and she sat in a hospital conference room and listened to a discharge planner explain the level of care her mother would need and calculated, in the space of that conversation, that she could not sustain a medical student's income and her mother's rehabilitation costs simultaneously. The math had not been close. She had withdrawn from UIC at 23. She was 27 now. The textbooks were in a sealed box in the closet. She didn't open the closet unless she needed her winter coat, and even then she kept her eyes on the coat. The sign language was a remnant. A clinical elective in her 2nd year, a course designed for medical students who wanted to serve deaf and hard-of-hearing patients. She had been genuinely good at it. Her professor had told her she had unusual fluency for a hearing student, something about the quality of attention she brought to what hands communicated when voices went quiet. She hadn't signed anything in 4 years. The knowledge had lived somewhere below the level of conscious access, the way the body holds things the mind releases, and it had surfaced tonight without warning or intention, called up by the sight of a child sitting alone in a gilded room. She visited her mother the next morning. Diane was in her chair by the window, watching the street with the patient absorption of someone who had learned to find a whole world in a small frame. She looked up when Renee came in, and her face did the thing it always did when she saw her daughter, a warmth so complete and uncomplicated that it sometimes felt like more than Renee knew what to do with. They sat together for 2 hours. Renee didn't mention the job. She talked about the spring starting, about a book she'd been working through, about a cardinal she'd seen on the fire escape that week. Her mother listened and occasionally squeezed her hand, and on a good language day, which this was, moderately, offered fragments in return. Words that arrived in the right order or in a different but still navigable order, building meaning from the available materials. They had developed, over 2 years, a fluency in each other's gaps. It was its own kind of language. On the bus back to Pilsen, Her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She almost let it go to voicemail, which would have meant a different story. But something, the quality of the silence from the night before, the letter S forming slowly against a small chest, made her pick up. He was standing on the sidewalk in front of her building when she arrived home, which meant he had been waiting. He had not sent a representative or an assistant or a car. He had come himself, which she noted and did not quite know what to do with. In the gray morning light of a Pilsen street, Eugen Beck looked different than he had in the Whitmore dining room, not diminished, exactly, but reconfigured. The authority was still present, structural, the kind you don't put on and take off, but the smooth executive finish had worn thinner overnight. There were marks under his eyes that spoke to no sleep. His posture, still precise, was working harder than it had been the night before. He spoke before she could. "I want to hire you. As a caregiver for my daughter. Live-in arrangement, Monday through Friday. The compensation, no." A beat of surprise. A man who rarely encountered that syllable. "You haven't heard the figure. You humiliated me in front of 12 people because I said hello to a child who was being ignored at her own father's table. I don't need to hear a figure." He looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't categorize. It lived in the neighborhood of discomfort and something adjacent to respect. $12,000 per month. Full health coverage, including for one dependent. Renee kept her face completely still. $12,000 a month was more than 14 months of what she had been making. Health coverage for a dependent was her mother's rehabilitation costs removed from the hemorrhaging category and placed somewhere manageable. It was the box in the closet possibly coming back down. She let none of this reach her expression. "Why me?" Not about the money. He was quiet for a moment. What came next had the quality of a man reading from a script he finds personally humiliating, but has decided to read anyway because the alternative is worse. "My daughter's name is Sina. She is 7 years old. She has not produced voluntary speech since she was 3. I have engaged 14 specialists across 3 countries. Every intervention has produced no sustainable response." He stopped. Something moved in his throat. Last night was the first time in 8 months that she offered a communication to another person without being directly prompted. You produced that in under 40 seconds. Renee looked at him. Past the posture. Past the control. What happened to her? When she was 3. The composure sealed over something immediately, like watching a window close. That information is classified for the purposes of this conversation. It isn't classified for me. If you want me working with her, I need to understand what I'm working with. Ms. Caldwell. The weight of his voice when he wanted to end a discussion was considerable. My daughter requires someone who can communicate with her. I am offering you the means to care for whoever you were visiting this morning in Evanston. He paused on that, letting her know he had done his research, done it overnight, done it before coming here. One condition. You operate within the therapeutic protocols that Dr. Park has established. You do not freelance. You do not discuss her history externally. One condition from me. Renee kept her voice level. You don't supervise how I connect with her. What happened last night, whatever that was, it happened because I wasn't performing for an audience. You want that for Sina? You give me the room to do it. The look on his face was that of a man swallowing something large and dry. Agreed. I'll start Monday. She went inside without looking back. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time afterward, not doing anything, just sitting with the particular feeling of a door opening onto a room whose contents she couldn't yet see. The Bayek residence occupied the top 2 floors of a building on North Lake Shore Drive with an unobstructed view of Lake Michigan that Renee initially tried not to react to, because reacting to it felt like acknowledging a gap she hadn't been invited to close. She got past that in roughly 48 hours. The lake was simply there. It was very beautiful. She allowed herself to find it beautiful. Sina's world was the east wing of the upper floor. A bedroom with soft colors and a window seat, a small sitting room, a therapy room with rounded corners and gentle acoustics, designed by a specialist in trauma-informed environments, where Dr. Park came 3 times a week. There were 4 staff members in the residence: a housekeeper, a chef, a driver, and a house manager, who moved through the space with the trained quietness of people who had been explicitly instructed not to make demands on the child. None of them had found a way in. Renee understood immediately why. They had all been trying to enter Sena's world, presenting themselves at its door, making their availability known, offering things that required a response. They were approaching the silence as a problem to be solved from the outside. Renee did not approach it that way. She spent the first 3 days doing nothing that required anything from Sena. She read in the sitting room while the girl drew in her sketchbook across the room, and she signed to herself at intervals. Small, ambient things, narrating what she was looking at, naming objects in the middle distance, not directing any of it toward Sena, not pausing for response, not making the signing a performance. She was simply a person who communicated with her hands, existing in the shared space, neither crowding it nor withdrawing from it. Sena watched. That was all. But the quality of her watching changed across those 3 days. From the systematic assessment of new territory to something that required a different word, something closer to interest. Eugen arrived without announcement on Wednesday afternoon. He had that habit, appearing in doorways without the social preparation of a knock, as if the residence was simply an extension of his operational space and did not require entry protocols. He stood in the sitting room doorway and looked at the 2 of them, Sena drawing, Renee reading, the room carrying the specific quality of 2 people existing comfortably in silence, with an expression that Renee, from her peripheral vision, clocked as a man trying very hard not to interfere with something he was afraid to disturb. She has speech therapy at 4. His voice came from the doorway. I know. I'll walk her down. Dr. Park prefers the transition to be managed by familiar. I've reviewed the full protocol documentation. I know what Dr. Park prefers. She turned a page without looking up. You said you wouldn't interfere. Another significant silence. He left without responding. She found him in the kitchen 2 hours later, standing over a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at the lake with the expression of a man who has run out of things to control and doesn't know what to do with his hands. It was, she thought, possibly the most human she had seen him look. Renee poured herself a glass of water. She was heading back to the East Wing. Did she draw today? The question came just as she reached the doorway. Quiet, almost casual, as if it hadn't been waiting behind everything else he'd said and not said since he arrived. She turned. Yes. What did she draw? A pause. A window. He absorbed that. He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they are holding something in that they intended to say. She left him with it. 11 days in, Sena asked for water, not with her voice, with her hands. A small, imprecise version of the ASL sign. Her wrist rotated past the correct angle, her fingers slightly too spread, but entirely legible in its intention. She raised the sign and held it there, looking at Renee with an expression that was the most directed thing she had produced yet. Not quite a request, not quite a question, but something in the range of both. An offering, maybe. An experiment. A test of whether this particular language would be met. Renee got up. She poured a glass of water from the kitchen and set it on the low table in front of Sena. Then she signed back, slowly, the correct form of the word. Not as a correction, not as a lesson, but the way you echo something back to show you've received it. As if to say, yes, that's the word. It landed. Sena studied the sign, studied the glass, looked back at Renee with something that lived very close to certainty. She tried the sign again, closer this time, the wrist at the right angle, her fingers almost right. Renee signed back. Good. That was exactly right. She hadn't heard the door. She didn't know how long he had been in the hallway, but when she glanced toward the edge of the door frame, she caught a sliver of him, completely still, watching, and then the sliver was gone. She turned back to Sina. At the corner of the girl's mouth, something was happening. It wasn't a smile. It was the shape that a smile makes in the moment before a person has decided whether to let it be one. Renee kept her expression steady and warm and deliberately unremarkable, because she understood that this was a moment that would harden if it was examined too closely. She signed. Do you want anything else? Sina considered. Signed. No. With her free hand. Perfectly. She had apparently been practicing. That night, returning from her visit to her mother's facility, later than usual, the bus slow through post-rain traffic, Renee let herself into the residence to find the entrance hall quiet and a folded sheet of paper on the console table with her name written on the outside in handwriting that was controlled and precise and told her exactly who had put it there. Inside, a payment confirmation from a foundation whose name she didn't recognize, applied to the outstanding balance on Diane Caldwell's rehabilitation account. 4 months. Cleared. There was no note. No accompanying message. Nothing that could be raised in conversation without the person who had done it being forced to acknowledge it, which she suspected was entirely intentional. She stood in the entrance hall for a long time. She was furious, and she was moved, and she was deeply confused about what to do with either of those things simultaneously, and she had no good container for any of it, so she folded the paper back along its original creases and went to bed. In the morning, she said nothing. Neither did he. But something in the atmosphere of the residence had shifted, some molecule rearranged without announcement, some pressure differential in the air between them that both of them were aware of and neither of them named. The vocabulary expanded the way real learning expands. Not in a straight line, but in bursts, with plateaus between them that might look like stagnation from the outside, but were actually consolidation, the new knowledge finding its architecture. By 3 weeks in D, Sena was signing water. More, yes, no, stop, please, thank you, and the full letter of her name. She had also begun to combine more please, stop, wait, the connective tissue of communication. Dr. Park had told Renee, in a careful voice that was working hard to contain its own astonishment, that she had observed more functional progress in 21 days than in the previous 18 months of intervention. She had said it the way a scientist says something that requires her to reconsider her framework. Renee had simply nodded and said she would keep her posted. The breakthrough that changed everything did not happen in the therapy room. It happened in the hallway, on a Tuesday morning, while Renee was walking Sina slowly past the objects of the residence and signing their names: door, window, table, painting, floor. The slow work of naming the world, which Renee had found was one of the most fundamental human pleasures, and one that Sina seemed to feel acutely. Sina stopped in front of a framed photograph on the wall. It was a group photograph, clearly from some formal event, a gala, or a corporate dinner, the kind with flowers and black ties, and the particular smiling that people do when they are being documented. Eugene was at the center, perhaps 2 or 3 years younger, surrounded by associates. The people around him had the satisfied look of people who had achieved what they had gathered to achieve. He did not quite look satisfied. He looked like a man who had learned to approximate satisfaction for photographs. Sina studied the photograph for a long moment. Then she made a sign Renee didn't recognize. A specific movement, not random, not experimental, but deliberate and controlled, as if it had been used before, as if it meant something specific to the person making it. She repeated it, looked at Renee, repeated it again. Renee signed back. Again. Show me again. Sina showed her. Her hand moved to the photograph, to one specific face, on the left side of the frame. A man in his mid-40s, standing slightly behind Yujin's right shoulder, with the particular permanence of someone who has occupied that position for a long time. He was neat, unremarkable at a glance, the kind of presence that registers as background. Renee signed, "Who is that?" Senna looked at the question, looked at the photograph, and then she put both hands over her own eyes, pressed them there, held them. A gesture that was not ASL, and was not any formal sign system. It was older, more private, the kind of thing a very small child does in the dark to try to make something disappear when she doesn't have any other tool available. Renee went very still. She kept her face warm and open and absolutely still. When Sina lowered her hands, Renee signed, "You know him, not a question." Sina answered anyway. She made the invented sign again, insistent, urgent in its specificity. That night, Renee sat at the desk in her room and worked through every ASL dictionary and database she could access, searching for the sign Sina had shown her. Nothing matched. She tried every variant, every regional difference, every historical form. The sign did not exist in any documented system. It was private language, the kind that forms in isolation, when a child has an experience she has no official words for and builds her own vocabulary in the dark, alone, for 4 years. She pulled up the resident staff directory, cross-referenced the photograph. The man was Dae-ho Shin, 46 years old, 12-year employee of Bayek Capital, currently holding the title of personal executive assistant. Highest security clearance within the organization. Present at every major event, every client meeting, every international trip, every Moman event. Renee sat with that for a long time. Long enough for the lake outside to turn from dark to the particular pre-dawn blue that comes just before the light returns. Then she went to find Yujin. His study was, as she had expected, exactly the kind of room a man like him would design around himself. Dark wood, spare surfaces, controlled light, a single large painting, nothing unnecessary, nothing that hadn't been deliberately chosen. Even the books on the shelves, she noticed, had no gaps. They stood without spaces, as if randomness itself had been organized out. He looked up when she entered. He had the expression of a man who had learned to brace for incoming information, which told her he'd been awake, too. Sina pointed to someone in the hallway photograph today. Renee kept her voice even. "The man standing behind your right shoulder in the group frame, Dae-ho Shin." Something moved in his face, contained immediately. "Dae-ho has been with me 12 years. Sina has been aware of him her entire life." She made a private sign I've never seen in any ASL database, something she invented, something specific. And then she covered her eyes like she was trying to make him disappear. Sina has intrusive trauma responses to a range of stimuli. The specialists have documented Yujin. It stopped him. She had used his given name without title for the first time. In the architecture of their dynamic, it was a small breach, and they both felt it. I know what trauma responses look like. I also know what recognition looks like. They are physiologically and behaviorally different. What Sina showed me today was not a symptom. It was information about a specific person, and she needed me to receive it. He was very still. The kidnapping investigation was closed 4 years ago. The detectives established that no one within my organization. When did Dae-ho take extended leave? Any gaps in attendance in the 2 years before or after Sina was taken? Silence. The kind that has a shape and a weight, and is itself a kind of answer. This is not your area. His voice was very controlled. You are here because of what you can do for my daughter, not for this. I am here because of your daughter. A beat, which is exactly why I'm telling you. She left him with it. She didn't know, walking back down the corridor, whether she had opened something he would act on, or something he would wall off in the way he walled off most things that frightened him. She only knew that Sina had stood in front of that photograph and insisted on being heard, and someone had to carry that forward. It was becoming a pattern, she realized. The kitchen, after midnight, the lake beyond the windows. A man who commanded rooms and moved billions and carried himself like a system that never went offline, apparently could not sleep, and when he couldn't sleep, he ended up in his own kitchen looking like someone who hadn't yet decided what the rules of the space were. Sina had woken from something. Not quite a nightmare. The sound that came through the monitor was more like distress without direction. And Renee had spent 20 minutes sitting beside her in the dark, close but not crowding, until the child's breathing settled back into sleep. She was heading to her own room when she saw the light under the kitchen door. She went in. She didn't announce herself or make conversation. She went to the refrigerator, found leftover rice, started the stove. He watched her from across the island with an expression that was entirely undefended. No strategy, no architecture, just a tired man in a room at midnight who had stopped performing for the hour. "Why did you leave medicine?" Not an accusation. Genuine. She kept her eyes on the pan. "My mother had a stroke at 61. The care she needed was more than I could fund on a student income. The math was not close. You were good at it. I would have been excellent at it." A pause. "I'm not saying that to be arrogant. I just know what I was capable of, and I know what I chose, and they are two different things." He was quiet for a moment, watching the steam rise from the pan. And the signing. Clinical elective, 2nd year of pre-med. I hadn't used it in 4 years before your daughter looked at my hands in that dining room. "Why did you cross the room that night? It wasn't your assignment." She considered. Because she was alone in a room full of people, and everyone was pretending not to notice, and I have spent my entire life watching that happen to people, and I am constitutionally incapable of pretending along with them. A pause. Then, why wasn't she with a caregiver that night? He moved. A slight shift, weight redistributing. The specialist recommended social environments. I was following the protocol. His voice had flattened in a specific way, the flatness of a man reciting something he has recited many times as a form of self-defense. "I follow every protocol. I have not been able to reach her." He looked at her then. Really looked. The way he almost never did, without the apparatus. She was missing for 19 days. She was 3 years old. When they found her, she was physically unharmed. His throat moved. "She has never said a word since the day they brought her home. My former wife, Sina's mother, left 2 years after. She has never stopped believing that if I had not been in that meeting, if I had been in the garden where I said I would be, that Sina would be different now." A pause. She is not wrong. She might be wrong about the meeting. Renee's voice was quiet. "She is not wrong that you carry it." She set a bowl of rice between them. She sat down across from him, not because she had decided to, but because her body did it before she had time to evaluate. He looked at the bowl, then at her. A look that lasted long enough to have content in it, not the controlled assessment she was used to from him, but something that asked a question his mouth wasn't ready to form. She looked back. She didn't retreat from it. "Sina forgave you." The words landed carefully. "She just doesn't have the language for it yet, but she's getting there." He was very still. Something moved behind his eyes. He looked at the lake. Neither of them spoke again for a while, but the silence had changed. It was no longer two people waiting for the other to retreat. It was something else entirely. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under her door overnight. A folded square of paper, no envelope, no marking on the outside. 6 words, printed in block letters with the deliberate impersonality of a person who knows exactly how handwriting can be read. "The girl doesn't remember. Keep it that way." Renee stood holding the paper in the early gray light for a long time. Then she photographed it with her phone from 4 angles, returned it to its fold, placed it in the interior pocket of her coat, and went about her morning as if it had not happened. The person who had written it needed to believe she had been frightened into compliance. She was not going to give them anything else to work with. She had been followed for 3 days. She'd had a hypothesis for 2 of them, and a certainty for 1. A figure that appeared at the edges of routes she varied deliberately. A dark car that had been in 2 different neighborhoods on the same afternoon. Someone was tracking her movements, calculating what she knew, measuring how much of a problem she had become. She found Eugene before he left for the office and showed him the photograph on her phone. She watched him read the words. She watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. Not close, not compose, but simply go still in the way that precedes a decision that's already been made. I looked at the personnel file. No preface, no preamble. His eyes were on the lake. Last night, after what you told me, 2 years before the kidnapping, so 6 years ago, Daeho had a gambling debt. Significant. Corporate intelligence flagged a single large deposit that cleared it overnight. The internal review was conducted and closed. He passed. Renee kept her voice very level. Who ran the review? A pause with an entire investigation inside it. Daeho ran the preliminary assessment. The final sign-off was mine, based on his summary. The silence in the room had a particular weight. Where is he now? Renee asked. He was in the office yesterday. He has always been exceptional at reading me. His jaw worked. He knows. He's known for at least a week that something has shifted. The phone rang from the hallway. The housekeeper's voice, carefully controlled. Mr. Beck. Sina is not in her room. The residence had 3 floors and 8 primary rooms, and Renee moved through them in under 4 minutes. Fast and absolutely precise. Her mind doing the thing it had learned in 2 years of clinical training and never quite unlearned. Stay sharp exactly when everything in the body wants to do the opposite. She cleared the bedroom, the therapy room, the sitting room, the library, the second bathroom. The housekeeper had the first floor. Building security had locked the elevators at Eugene's instruction 30 seconds after the call. She stopped in the center of the upper hallway. 10 seconds. Just standing. Where does a frightened child go? Not toward noise. Not toward adults she doesn't control the access to. Toward the first thing that felt safe. The first specific thing. She went to the east corridor window. The window with the view of the lake that Sina had told her, in their growing vocabulary of signs, looked like water in the sky. The window in front of which Sina had sat on the very first day, assessing her new territory. The window that Sina returned to when the residence felt too large. The storage alcove beside the window had a low door designed to blend with the wall paneling. You had to know it was there. Renee pressed the edge. The door opened. Sina was inside, knees pulled to her chest, back pressed against the far wall of the narrow space. And behind her, crouched in the shadows with the expression of a man who has made one wrong calculation and is in the process of making another, was Daeho Shin. Renee's body did several things simultaneously. Catalogued. He had not touched her. Sina's posture was frightened but not injured. The small space was navigable. She was between him and the only exit. Sina's eyes found Renee in the same instant the light changed, and the look in them, Renee would carry it for the rest of her life, was not relief, exactly. It was recognition. The look of someone who had been holding on and had known, with a quiet and fundamental certainty, that the person they were holding on for would come. Daeho rose, unhurried, a careful man doing what careful men do, recalibrating in real time, finding the angle. Missy Caldwell. I was looking for her as well. She wandered down here on her own and I'm sure. Her voice was warm and completely opaque. Her body did not move from the doorway. She signed to Sina without breaking eye contact with him. Come here. Take your time. I have you. Sina looked at Daeho, looked at Renee. made the assessment that she should have never had to make with the expertise of a child whose survival had required it at 3 years old. She moved, slowly but without hesitation. She pressed herself against Renee's side, and Renee put her hand on the girl's shoulder, steady, unmovable, a fixed point, without looking down. Something recalculated behind Daeho's eyes. He was deciding. Yujin's voice came from behind her, even and very cold. It already is. He had been 2 steps back the entire time. What followed was not loud. Loud things are for people who need the volume because the power isn't sufficient on its own. Yujin spoke to Daeho in Korean, low and absolutely level, and whatever the words were, they stripped away the last of the professional surface. 12 years of calculation collapsed in a hallway in 90 seconds. Renee turned her body so that it faced Sina rather than the men. She signed slowly, clearly. It's over. You did it right. You waited, and I came. Sina looked at her hands, then at her face. Then she signed something she had never signed before. Something that had not existed in her vocabulary until this moment, assembled from the components she'd been building for weeks, precise and deliberate. Safe. Building security arrived in under 3 minutes. Daeho was escorted from the premises with the careful efficiency of men who have been briefed. There would be calls that afternoon to the detective who had originally worked the kidnapping 4 years ago. A detective who had closed a case on incomplete evidence provided partly by the suspect. There would be financial records, a gambling debt, a payment that traced back through a shell company to a man who had orchestrated the disappearance of a 3-year-old girl to coerce her father into a business arrangement, and who had then remained close, for 4 years, because proximity was the only management strategy that kept the silence intact. All of that would come, the law and the evidence and the long institutional process of it. But in the corridor, with the lake light moving through the east window, Renee crouched down in front of Sina and signed, "You were very brave." Sina considered this with the seriousness she brought to all things that mattered. Then she signed back, "I knew you would come." Renee pressed her lips together, nodded once, stood. She did not cry in front of the child. She went to the kitchen and stood at the window for a long time, and cried there, quietly and alone, the way she had learned to do most things that cost her. He found Sina in her bedroom that evening. The security team had left. The detective had taken his statement, and the residents had settled into the particular exhausted quiet of a place that has been through something and is slowly returning to itself. Yujin sat on the edge of his daughter's bed with his hands on his knees and the careful physicality of a man who has spent 4 years being terrified of doing the wrong thing and has run out of the capacity to keep being terrified. Sina was in her bed with her sketchbook open, not yet sleeping, drawing something Renee couldn't see from the doorway. He signed, slowly, imperfectly. He had been teaching himself from online videos for 2 weeks, late at night when the residence was quiet, and his form was still wrong in the specific ways that beginners' forms are wrong, the angles slightly off, the rhythm not yet natural. He signed, "Sorry." He got the hand shape wrong. Renee, from the doorway, saw it and stayed absolutely quiet. Sina looked at her father's hands. She looked at the shape he had made, which was close, but not right. And then she did something that made Renee grip the doorframe. She reached out, gently, and took his hands in hers, adjusted them. With the deliberate patience of a child who has been waiting a long time to teach someone something important. He tried again. Correct this time. She signed back. Very small, very clear. "I know." The sound he made then was not a word. It was not quite a sob. It was the sound of a man whose entire architecture of composure had been built to protect something that was still, despite everything, alive, and which had just been reached. He pulled his daughter into his arms with the specific tenderness of someone who has been afraid to hold something breakable, and has finally understood that the not holding was where the damage was. Sina put her arms around his neck. She let herself be held. That was the whole miracle, that she chose it, that she reached back, that she stayed. Renee stepped back from the doorway. Some things were not hers to witness. She went to the kitchen and made tea, and sat with the lake until the light was entirely gone, and the water was only sound. 3 weeks after Dae-ho Shin was placed in custody and the investigation was formally reopened, and it turned out there had always been evidence, the kind that a 12-year proximity and a carefully positioned internal review had been enough to keep dormant. Yoo-jin came to find Renee on a Thursday morning. She was in the sitting room with Sina, who was teaching her a sign she had invented months ago in the solitude of her own interior world. A movement between the signs for drawing and thinking, which Sina used to mean the particular state of being entirely inside your own imagination, where the real world becomes muffled and the invented one becomes loud. They had been working for weeks on bridging Sina's private vocabulary to standard ASL, not replacing it, not erasing the language she had built alone in the dark, but expanding it, building bridges out from it into a world that could learn to meet her. Yoo-jin stood in the doorway. He looked at the two of them for a moment. He had been doing that more often lately, pausing at doorways, watching, as if each glimpse was something he needed to establish as real. "There's something I want to tell you. When you have a moment." Sina made the shooing gesture she had developed recently. "Go, I'm fine, you're hovering," with the particular authority of a child who has discovered she has preferences and intends to exercise them. Renee followed him into the hallway. "I spoke to the dean of the medical school at UIC. His eyes were on the wall slightly to her left, the place he looked when he was uncertain how something would land. There is a formal re-enrollment pathway for students who withdrew under documented family medical circumstances. The application window opens in 6 weeks. Yoo-jin. The first year's costs are already arranged through the foundation. You cannot refuse it because you cannot return it. The disbursement structure is... Yoo-jin." He stopped, looked at her. "You cannot keep solving things without asking me." "I know." A pause. "Mulin, I'm asking." The hallway was very quiet. The lake was visible at the far end through the window, gray and enormous and calm. "I'm asking." A different precision in his voice now. Not the precision of a man managing information, but the precision of a man who has decided that clarity is more important than protection. "Because I want you to stay. The role with Sina is yours for as long as you want it. But that is not the only thing I am asking about." Renee looked at him for a long moment, the man who had fired her in a gilded dining room, the man who had shown up on her Pilsen sidewalk in the gray morning because his pride had lost to his desperation, the man who had paid her mother's medical bills anonymously and stood in a hallway at midnight and told her things he clearly had not intended to say, the man who was currently learning sign language badly and practicing every night and not stopping. "You are possibly the most difficult person I have ever encountered. I have been informed of that. You are also..." She stopped. The corner of her mouth moved. "You are not what I thought you were. At all." "What did you think?" "Someone who couldn't be reached." Something shifted in his expression. It required significant effort. "On your part." "I wasn't trying to reach you. I was trying to help your daughter." "I know." Softer now. The quality his voice had when he had decided to say something regardless of the risk. "And in doing so, you will reach the child's father. Without intending to, which I suspect made it more effective, not less." She looked at him. He looked at her. No performance, no management, no composure deployed as a wall. Just two people in a hallway who had arrived, by a very complicated and unplanned route, at the same place at the same time. She took a step toward him. He did not step back. "Say the actual thing." Her voice was very quiet. "I love you." Clear, unhesitating, the way he delivered all things he was entirely certain of. "I did not plan for it. I would not, given the option, undo it. I am asking you to stay. Not as a caregiver, not as an employee. To stay. She kissed him. That was the whole answer. Simple and complete and definitive. The way good answers are. When she pulled back, he looked like a man who had been surprised by the depth of his own relief, as if he had been carrying something heavier than he'd catalogued and had just been allowed to set it down. From the sitting room, a small sound. A soft, rhythmic knock on the floor. Sina's signal for I can hear you and I know what's happening and you should come back now. Renee laughed. A real one. Yujin looked, for a moment, like a man who had forgotten this was something faces could do, and then his own face did it too. They went back. 6 months later, on a Saturday in September, when Chicago had finally, graciously, remembered that it knew how to be warm, the three of them were in Millennium Park. Sina was 8. Her birthday had been the previous month, and had involved a lemon cake with blueberry frosting, her choice, arrived at after considerable deliberation, and presented to the chef with the quiet authority of a child who has discovered that she has preferences and that people will honor them. She was still collecting that discovery. Every time it turned out to be true, something in her posture settled slightly further into itself. Her signed vocabulary now exceeded 400 words. More importantly, she had begun, 6 weeks earlier, tentatively, in the near dark of her bedroom when she thought perhaps only Renee could hear, to whisper. Not full speech. Not yet. Breath shaped around the edges of signs. Sound beginning to return to language the way light returns to a room when the curtains are slowly opened. Dr. Park was documenting it with the careful excitement of someone who has learned to wait. Dae-ho Shin had been charged. The trial was scheduled for spring. The detective who had originally closed the case had called Yujin on a Tuesday afternoon, and the conversation had been mostly silence, and the apology inside the silence had been received. Renee was 3 months into her re-enrollment at UIC. It was harder than she remembered, harder than she had romanticized in the years she'd kept the box closed, and it was exactly as important as she had always understood it to be. She studied with the particular intensity of someone who has lost time and carries the weight of that loss as fuel rather than grief. Yujin brought her tea at midnight without being asked, and sat near her while she worked without requiring conversation, and had apparently decided that love was something you practice in the specific language of the person you love. He was learning 2 languages simultaneously. He was not stopping. In the park, Sina ran slightly ahead of them, toward the Crown Fountain, where the enormous glass towers cycled through the faces of Chicago residents and children moved through the shallow water that flowed between them in the September sun. She turned back to look at the 2 adults trailing behind her and made the sign. Come on. Hurry up. Yujin signed back. We're coming. His wrist still turned slightly wrong. He was aware of it. He kept going. Renee took his hand. He looked down at their hands, then up at her face, with an expression she had learned to recognize. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for what a man does with a feeling that has arrived after he stopped expecting it. She filed it, as she filed all things she intended to keep, in the part of her that did not have a word for itself yet. Sina had stopped at the edge of the water. She turned around and looked at them, at her father and the woman who had crouched down in a gilded room and said hello when no one else would, who had crossed the silence that everyone else had decided was impassable, who had known her language when Sina had believed she was the only person in the world who spoke it. She raised both hands, made the sign she had invented, alone, in the long quiet of her childhood, the sign that had lived in her private grammar without a recipient for 4 years, waiting for a moment that deserved it. Family. Yujin's grip on Renee's hand tightened. She squeezed back. They walked toward her, and the September light fell across the 3 of them, and Sina turned back to the water and stepped in, and the world was, for this moment, exactly the size it needed to be. If this story moved you, Subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were Renee?